past 50 years. To have Paul Samuelson as our Godkin lecturer in this year when the school is celebrating our 50th anniversary is therefore especially fitting. 1936 was an eventful year at Harvard. Just ask Paul, who was completing his first year as a graduate student in economics here at Harvard. As Harvard was celebrating a tercentenary, Lucius Littauer was making a gift that made possible the establishment of the Faculty of Public Administration, and Alvin Hansen, then a professor at Michigan, was just a year away from becoming the first Littauer professor at Harvard. From the moment of his arrival in Cambridge until this moment, Paul Samuelson has been an enfant terrible. At the conclusion of Paul's oral exam for the PhD, Joseph Schumpeter is reported to have turned to Alvin Hansen and inquired, "Well, Alvin, did we pass?" Some colleagues at MIT refer to him today as an enfant terrible emeritus. Born in Gary, Indiana in 1915, the son of Polish immigrants, Paul received a BA from the University of Chicago before taking his PhD at Harvard. As he recalls his days as a graduate student, and I quote, "It was pure heaven with reams of blank paper, sharpened pencils, no duties, adequate pay, and best of all, most of what needed doing in economic theory had not yet been done." Public policy doctoral students take note. Paul's dissertation won the David A. Wells Prize and was published in 1947 as The Foundations of Economic Analysis. In 1940, Harvard's loss was MIT's gain. Samuelson became an assistant professor there, and a new major department of economics began to emerge. In 1947, Paul won the John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association. In 1948, he published Economics, which rapidly became the most popular textbook in economics of all time. Currently in its 12th edition, it has been translated into over 20 languages and has sold more than 3 million copies in English. The book went a long way towards giving the world a common language of economics. Indeed, at one time, 40% of the introductory economics courses in the U.S. used it. Today, many of us measure our vintage by the edition we read as students. Over almost 5 decades following, Paul has produced path-breaking articles in virtually every area of economics. MIT has just published the 5th edition of the Collected Scientific Papers of Paul Samuelson. At the same time, as a strong believer that economists have an obligation to contribute to social issues, Paul has served as a consultant to many government agencies, including the Federal Reserve Board, the U.S. Treasury, the Council of Economic Advisors, and others. One of John Kennedy's favorite economists, Paul headed Kennedy's task force that drew up the administration's economic blueprint of tax cuts and increased social service spending, the so-called Kennedy tax cut. During Lyndon Johnson's years, he led the Great Society Advisory Committee charged with sustaining American prosperity. From 1966 to 1981, he wrote a column for Newsweek that earned him a spot on Richard Nixon's enemies list. Paul is, I think, without question, the economist of this era. When the authors of a two-volume critique of contemporary economic theory needed a title for their book, they simply called it Anti-Samuelson. His standing and popularity led William F. Buckley to spend a portion of God and Man at Yale complaining of Paul's, quote, typical glibness and rank soap opera appeal, close quote. But then we know about Yaleys. The Swedish Academy of Science had a more considered opinion when it chose him as the first American to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. The prize committee said, again I quote, his extensive production covering nearly all areas of economic theory is characterized by an outstanding ability to derive important new theorems and define new applications for existing ones. By his contributions, Samuelson has done more than any other contemporary economist to raise the level of scientific analysis in economic theory, close quote. To recall this stellar career and life, including Harvard's small part in it, without acknowledging two unpleasant strands would be inappropriate. In 1936, as Harvard awarded more than 60 honorary degrees to leading scholars of the era, no omission was more striking than that of the individual about whom Paul will have a lot to say tonight. The omission of John Maynard Keynes was not accidental, as Paul has commented. Harvard slights almost never are. The barons of the economics department had vetoed the name of Keynes because his ideas seemed too radical or unorthodox. 4 years later, in 1940, the economics department made an even larger error when it failed to appoint Paul Samuelson as an assistant professor, reflecting, at least as some people tell the story, a view that a person of his ethnic and religious background was not quite what Harvard needed. That anti-Semitism and rigid orthodoxy played such an important role at Harvard so recently is a sad but stern reminder. The undermining of such prejudices testifies mightily to a truth John Maynard Keynes stated so clearly in The General Theory, a book also published in 1936. And I quote, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Soon or late, it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil," close quote. The title of tonight's lecture is How Keynes Came to America via Harvard and Alvin Hansen. And we're very pleased to have in the audience two of Alvin Hansen's daughters. Maybe they could just raise their hands here on the front row. Tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. here in the school Star Auditorium, Paul will deliver the second Godkin lecture entitled The Structure of the Scientific Revolution. Please join me in welcoming back to Harvard the man whom we should have never let escape, Paul Samuelson.
It is a great honor to give Godkin lectures at Harvard. It's worth coming all the distance that I've had to travel to be here. And I would honestly have to say that $6 million is a small price to pay for that honor. This is an exercise in remembrance. By chance, the 50th anniversary of the Harvard School of Public Administration coincides with the 350th anniversary of the university. What is important for economic science, and my purpose on this occasion, is that this year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of John Maynard Keynes' General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. That work constitutes a genuine revolution in science by every criterion of Thomas Kuhn's famous 1962 Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Also, by coincidence, and perhaps even by miscalculation, it was just 50 years ago that Alvin Hansen was named the first Lucius Littauer Professor of Political Economy in Harvard's new school. Historians speak of Marx before he was a Marxian. Since Hansen, so to speak, changed his name from Saul to Paul only on the train between Minnesota and Massachusetts, the Harvard elders in economics can be said to have lucked out by not knowing what it was they were getting when they appointed Hansen before he was a Hansenian. Had I more time, and this audience more patience, I would spell out Mother Nature's cosmic random walk that led ultimately to the collision of the planet Harvard with the meteor Alvin Hansen. Note how the word cosmic includes within itself the word comic. That saga would involve President Eliot's letter to a raw son of the middle border, Thomas Nixon Carver. If I would meet you halfway, could we discuss a call to Harvard? They met at Syracuse, New York, between Oberlin, Ohio, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. I don't know who paid the bill. In no time at all, Carver was in the Harvard yard, ready when Frank Taussig had a sabbatical nervous breakdown to take over the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the economics department. When you owe and ah about Mr. Eliot's marvelous judgment in unilaterally picking out the unqualified William James and Henry Adams for Harvard posts, spare some enthusiasm for the humdrum system of peer committee review by putting into the scale the mediocre performances of T.N. Carver and Edwin F. Gay, which constitutes the other side of the Eliot coin. The only documentation of Gay's appointment in the archives is supposed to be the laconic note in Eliot's handwriting: "Wife has independent income. They live on it." Well, in the course of time, Carver begot for Harvard John D. Black, the one-man dynamo of agricultural economics. It was Black who ferreted out for Harvard his old colleagues at Minnesota, Pittram Sorokin and Alvin Hansen. Hansen's unfavorable review of the general theory clinched for himself the chair offer. My next section I entitle An Elizabethan Age. Hansen soon came to be called, justly called, the American Keynes. This means more than that he spread the Keynesian message to the American Gentiles. Actually, in the 20 years after 1936, Hansen was the principal developer and tester of the new paradigm. He and his school that became a mighty host proved that in science, water does rise above its source. English mathematics languished in the dusk following Isaac Newton's high noon. In the age after Newton, on the continent, such magnificent followers of Leibniz as Euler, the many Bernoullis, Lagrange, and Laplace forged a mighty corpus of rational mechanics. After the 1946 death of the master, British Keynesianism, with some brilliant exceptions by Robinson, Herod, and Caldor, froze into a kind of decadence, as became so painfully evident in the 1959 Radcliffe Report on the workings of the monetary system. It was in America that Keynes's seed germinated. Keynes had concentrated in 1936 on the autonomous macroeconomic behavior of a laissez-faire society. Joseph Schumpeter, in his Harvard lectures, tried to discount Keynes as a provincial Englishman with the paradigm generated out of that milieu's parochial properties. Keynes was a parochial Englishman, but Schumpeter, we students felt, spoke partially with a green tongue. The basic Keynes model, call it by the Hicks-Hansen name of the ISLM model, did not really fit an open island economy nearly so well as it applied to the great continental economy of the United States with its virtual independence of balance of payments constraints. I remind you I am talking about ancient history. Also, by the happenstance of history, the avalanche of gold that flowed into the United States served much like an unplanned but controlled monetary experiment to authenticate the empirical applicability just before World War II of the kind of liquidity trap that characterized the Deep Depression version of the Keynesian model. Here and not in Europe was it the case in the late 1930s that the shortest term rate of interest had sunk to the floor of 0.03% per annum. Money really didn't matter then. Pity those Neanderthal Keynesians who let their minds freeze at the age of 29 and carried into the 1950s and beyond the belief that money would never again matter. I could be forgiven for exaggerating a mite the role of Hansen and Harvard in the Keynesian revolution at a birthday party like this one. On such occasions, Dr. Samuel Johnson said, one is not under oath. But there is no need to exaggerate. Important Keynesians in America, such as Oscar Lange or Franco Modigliani or Abba Lerner or Jacob Marshak or Sidney Weintraub, represented an independent and complementary source of the Keynesian infection. However, to arrive at a rough quantitative measurement of the Hansen School's importance, I once analyzed the originators of the famous balanced budget multiplier doctrine. For those of you who were away from school the morning they taught that theorem, let me merely say that it stated what first seemed like a paradox. Even if the government ran no deficit, an equal increase in expenditure and tax revenues will expand the level of GNP by the amount of that increase. Leaving aside Jorgen Gelting, who unknown to all of us had worked out that result in Denmark, here I list the names of its many co-discoverers. A historian of science like Robert K. Merton, recalling how Newton and Leibniz and Darwin and Wallace almost simultaneously discovered their great innovations, will know that doubletons and multiple discoverers are the rule rather than the exception in science. Thomas Kuhn has documented that at least a dozen scholars deserve credit for first glimpsing the law of conservation of energy. I enumerate the following scholars who were somehow in on the balanced budget finding: Hansen and Keynes themselves, Keynes in the budget speech of 1941, the late William Salant, Paul Samuelson, and Harold Summers. Those are in alphabetical order. Richard Goodwin, Trygve Hobelmo, Gottfried Haberler, Everett Hagen, Nicholas Kaldor, Thomas Schelling, and Arthur Smithies. I'm sure I have overlooked a few worthies. Of the above dozen names, only Keynes, Kaldor, and Hagen were not directly or indirectly in the Hansen Farm Club. Let me digress as a footnote to say that on the more general problem of defining the income-creating measure of fiscal policies, one adds the names of Lachlan Curry, Martin Crost, and Henry Villard. Only the last lacks the crimson old-school tie. Curry, by the way, is the oldest living Harvard PhD in economics. He is living somewhat in exile from the McCarthy era in Colombia. Kenneth Galbraith, I believe, errs in his article on how Keynes came to America in believing that Curry was let go by Harvard on account of his Keynesian notions. In 1934, Curry was a supply of money maven. Only later did he and his boss at the Federal Reserve, Mariner Eccles, effectively push Keynes-like policies. We can assay the strength of the Harvard-Hansen synergism by the contributors in 1947 to the 60th birthday festschrift for Alvin Hansen. By that time, Hansen had spent just about an equal length of time at the University of Minnesota and at Harvard. We editors hoped to include as many of his Minneapolis pupils as Cambridge. Even though Minnesota was then a leading Big Ten Department of Economics, which had had on its staff such worthies as Frederick Garver, Arthur Margott, George Stigler, In the end, almost all the contributors were from the Harvard years. Actually, all of them were. Later, when I asked Hansen about this puzzle, he said, first, there's only one Keynesian revolution. Second, we encourage the best people to bubble off and go to the few leading places. That is excellent advice for a careerist. If you know you are really good, beg, borrow, or steal, but get to Rome. I mean Harvard, or MIT, or you name it. What is good advice for young scholars is good advice for a middle-aged scientist like Alvin Hansen. His influence might have been great from anywhere, from Yankton College in South Dakota or West Colorado State. But that influence was immeasurably leveraged by his being at Harvard. As my pen once wrote, yes, Harvard made us, but it was we active spirits who made Harvard Harvard. The course of science is perturbed by crude chance. For whatever reason, the other strong American economic departments were mainly out to lunch during the Keynesian Revolution. Chicago, in the afterglow of Frank Knight, Jacob Viner, and Paul Douglas, largely sat out the monopolistic competition revolution, and after Henry Schultz's death, the mathematical economics revolution. To be sure, Oscar Lange and a reconstituted Coles Commission group provided an alternative track on the Midway, but in Cook County, as elsewhere, prophets are often without much honor in their own countryside. At Columbia, Wesley Mitchell, J. Morris Clark, and Harold Hotelling illustrated the Schumpeterian truth that Kuhnian revolutions are a young blade's game. In 1936, Stanford was still a pleasant farm. Berkeley was only beginning her ascent under Robert Calkins and E.T. Grether. Princeton had not yet awakened from her country club siesta. Yale, a Tory borough, was busy elevating Irving Fisher to Willard Gibbs' category of overlooked local genius. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so the Alexanders, Bishops, Browns, Domars, Goodwins, Yazis, Lintners, Metzlers, Musgraves, the two Salants, Schelling, Solo, the three Sweezys, and Tobins honored Cambridge with their presence. The doctrine of St. Matthew and of Adam Smith and Alan Young holds in science. To those who have shall be given. Innovation satisfies homogeneous production functions of degree greater than one. In Japan, they would laugh at this point. The audience is failing me. When Hansen propounded in the morning the problem of the accelerator and the multiplier, it was a resource and a pleasure to be able that very evening to try out your solutions on an eager circle of Metzlers, Musgraves, and Higginses. Yankton College was never like that. To calibrate Harvard's role in the Keynesian Revolution, I owe most to the brash young man whose passed-down skin I now occupy. Like Nabokov, I lie on my couch and say, speak memory. By the way, that's a great way to do research. Then my pen records what I hear. I was there. More uniquely, I am one of the few left who was there before there was a Keynesian there. Talleyrand said no one could understand the French Revolution who had not known the sweetness of the Ancien Regime. You cannot know the Keynesian Revolution unless you have savored the vacuum of 1850, 1935 macroeconomics. It consisted of atheoretical business cycles and models for the price level. But this is an exercise in remembrance and not in autobiography. Not for me what Mr. Dooley called the modesty of Teddy Roosevelt, who planned to title his book on the Spanish-American War, Me in Cuba. For my part in the events that follow, Legend and the texts have not failed to accord me all that I deserve. Of man and the times I sing, of Alvin Hansen and the Harvard Yard in the time of the Great Depression. Part of my title I have stolen from Kenneth Galbraith's fine piece, How Keynes Came to America. Who would have expected that an agricultural economist could get macroeconomic history so nearly right? I have benefited, too, from Walter Salant's lecture this autumn at the Conference on Keynes and Public Policy After 50 Years, sponsored by York University in Toronto. As I said at Walter's 75th birthday party recently, King Alphonse of Spain claimed that had he been in on the creation, he could have done a better job. Well, Walter did have a grandstand seat at the creation of the general theory as one of Keynes's Trinity pupils. And for more than half a century, he has been the meticulous conscience keeping the myths of history near to the way it really was. I don't know whether Sidney Alexander is in the room tonight, but Sidney Alexander, as a Henry Fellow, may have been Keynes' last two teams in the academic year 1936. Present subject, given at the 350th Centenary Seminar held at Harvard in September, and also from his 1985 San Antonio lecture in the Trinity University volume, The Lives of the Laureates, edited by William Bright and available for hard cash at the MIT Press. Luckiest of all for serious historians, Tobin's beautiful lecture notes from his undergraduate years enable me to verify that what I remember accords with what really happened. Men were men in those days, and they had to have very strong green bags to carry the law school volumes. And there, in Tobin's meticulous handwriting, is the wisdom of the period. And so I must again digress at this point. We are always complaining about the state of the undergraduate curriculum. Jim Tobin's quality is such that he could have become an educated person even by sitting on the opposite end of a log with Mark Hopkins. Jim Tobin never succeeded in getting less than an A. He never succeeded, even in the Navy, in not winning a competition, every competition. But I was amazed in reading his notes on the courses given by Schumpeter, Edward Mason, and Paul Sweezy. That's one course. Edward Chamberlain, Richard Gilbert, and John Williams, Spencer Pollard, and Seymour Harris. What a magnificent education Harvard could offer in the late 1930s. And much of the best of it came from teaching assistants whose use we profess to deplore. In season and out, the world has heard me badmouth the influence of Harold Hitchings Burbank. To him I have never applied the doctrine nihil nisi bonum, but only the doctrine nihil nisi verum. He was the longtime czar of the economics department bureaucracy at Harvard. Yet, let the record note, and hear me say it, it was under the strong rule of Burbank that Tobin could encounter the great teachers whose wisdoms are embalmed in Tobin's huge-bound notebook. As long as I'm trying to render full justice, and it's time, let me digress for another couple of minutes. It is arrogant to say, I was there. That's the way it was. Ever since I attended my first carnival in Gary, Indiana, and observed peas under walnut shells, I have realized how fallible my own testimony can be. In several articles, I have reminisced about my great teacher and friend, Joseph Schumpeter. As much as anyone, I have perpetuated the canard that he was a brilliant but incoherent lecturer. I have even cited my own lecture notebooks as proof. So imagine my surprise when our former MIT PhD student, Charles E. Staley of Stony Brook University, wrote up the magnificent lectures that Schumpeter gave in the last years of his life on the basis of the lecture notes that Edward Ames took in Schumpeter's class. This appears in the History of Political Economy journal by Charles Staley. The quality of those lectures compared favorably, as shown by Staley, with the best passages in Schumpeter's posthumous classic, History of Economic Analysis. In bewilderment and some belief, being married to a woman from Missouri, I sampled Staley's discussion at random and requested, Patinkin-like, that he send me Xeroxes of Ed Ames' notes bearing on the selected topic. By return mail they came, and by God, there it all was in Ames' handwriting, just exactly as Homer had sung it out. For me, this was a lesson in humility. It was I who sat with the swine in Emerson Hall while Schumpeter cast his pearls before us. Incoherence is in the ear of the listener. Let the record show my willing recantation of the libel Schumpeter's memory suffered from my quill. Before further documenting Hanson's scientific importance, let me describe Harvard University of the 1930s. Any embarrassed person can hastily leave the room at this point. My section is called A Girl Called Alma. Too little gets recorded by the muse of history to record what different universities were really like at various stages of their life. On the one hand, we have the boilerplate of the usual official college history, written too often as made work to keep a superannuated scholar out of Satan's mischief. They tell when a new layer of deans began, but fail to catch what we want to know, what things were like. On another hand, I have read with interest and profit a baker's dozen of collections with titles like My Harvard, My Yale, Oxford as I Knew It, or Cambridge Days. If the invited contributors to such volumes become people of moment after commencement, we learn something about the celebrity as an adolescent. Amazingly, the accounts of four pivotal years so often forget to mention the curriculum or the faculty. All this was brought home forcefully to me many decades ago when I shared with Dean John Williams and Alice Bourneff a Back Bay Society dentist. Once that virtuoso lent me a diary privately printed by a client to honor a Crown and Shield DuPont ancestor who roamed the Harvard yard in antebellum days, by which I do mean the 1850s. The descendant of this estimable chap wrote a foreword to the slim volume in which he pointed out how refreshing it was in these benighted days of Roosevelt's New Deal to read about finer times. So my hopes were raised, only to be crudely dashed. I learned much about skating on Fresh Pond. Plenty of hangovers were copiously documented. Sometimes a dull week would be relieved by an entry which read, and I quote, "Much fun. We lighted the pants of Nigger Joe, who delivers the kindling. He sure did dance." I end my quote. What I looked for completely in vain was a single mention of a good lecture, or even a bad lecture. No faculty member disturbed our hero on his way to oblivion. That is not the Harvard I sing about tonight. It is Harvard University in the mid-1930s I address. This entity hardly existed then, except as a rarely recognized appendage to the Harvard College that did very much exist. Remember, it was the time when President Conant was newly replacing President Lowell. It's like the Italian monarchy. Victor Emmanuel is pro-Mussolini. Umberto is against Mussolini. It's a well-hedged portfolio. There are college presidents and there are university presidents. Lowell's long reign, 1911 to 1933, was college time, much like Pusey's later reign, in distinct contrast to the university epochs of Eliot, Conant, and Bach. The nurses in the specialized wards of Mass General Hospital like to joke about that institution's luxury wing. They say the advantage of Phillips House is that it is near a good hospital. To this very day, the curse of Oxford University is that it is so inseparably near to the Oxford colleges. Like matter and antimatter, which, so to speak, occupy the same spaces but never interact at all, Harvard University then coexisted independently of Harvard College. What did the likes of me know of Porcellian or the Fly Club? Probably not even their names. Unlike the Oxford case, Harvard University still gained net advantage at that time from Harvard College. Thus, the class of 1931, Douglas Dillon's and Paul Sweezy's class, enrolled a respectable fraction of America's millionaires, and some of their largesse filtered down to support John Black's agricultural economists, whose boots still radiated fermentations of the middle border. Later, when Conant converted the college into a meritocracy, it became a device for searching out, certifying, and recruiting talent for the serious university business of science and scholarship. 1935, the year I entered the Harvard Graduate School, without deigning to apply in advance, and with no more than my smallpox vaccination. You know, Oscar Wilde, when he came to America, said I had nothing to declare but my genius. I declared my smallpox vaccination and some petty ribbons for undergraduate prowess. That about marked the time of watershed. Shigeru Tsuru was half the Asians in the undergraduate class of 1935. Nor were there very many Europeans in Harvard College. What there were can be listed. A couple of hundred graduates of St. Grottlesex, most of whom lived in the New York and Boston areas. Commuters trained at Boston Latin School, like Theodore White later and William Langer earlier, and whoever's family had the $400 for tuition in that time of the Great Depression. By the time of Jim Tobin's class of 1939, Conant's regional scholars had begun the meritocracy mode of Harvard College, which became the gate to the establishment rather than its finishing school. Needless to say, where Harvard goes in 1939, Yale will aim for in 1949, and after what we economists call long and variable lags, Princeton will follow. There were no jobs in the mid-1930s, certainly no academic jobs. Each year, the graduate students got older and older. Why hurry? Especially in economics, where Chairman Burbank was able to keep salaries of instructor tutors at the princely stipend of $2,500 per year. And if you buttered them up, you might get some Radcliffe patronage to boot. At Berkeley, then, associate professors scarcely did as well. And at the land-grant schools of the Dakotas, even the football coach fared worse. Besides, if you were single, and most of us were, you might live in the houses as a resident tutor in medieval luxury. Crack arbitrageurs in Wall Street, 2 years out of the B school, don't do very much better today. I wrote that before the recent news. Don't let me give the impression that all was equal and fair in the monastery of learning. Genteel anti-Semitism was so pervasive that no one noticed it, any more than people noticed the oxygen they breathe. There were no black economists in my entering graduate school class. The few women in old Tausig's first course, the famous Ec 11, had to sit in their segregated gallery as in certain synagogues. They were allowed to participate only rarely in the Socratic service Tausig conducted. I once wrote that Tausig gave all of them C's until Alice Burniff whispered quietly in my ear, I got an A. After 1934, fate brought its sweet revenge. Schumpeter, as Tausig's successor, gave women only A's, along with Jesuit and Chinese A's, and what his assistant Paul Sweezy called good solid A's. In 1939, when a black was admitted to Lowell House, that Southern gentleman and Rhodes Scholar, William Yandell Elliott, said, very well, but don't expect me to sit next to him at tutor's table. It was that same Elliott who, as chairman of the government department, only a few years later went on humble knees to invite Ralph Bunche to a professorial chair. Bunche could not afford the honor. You in my audience born after 1930 will not be able to conceive what America was really like below its sunny surface in pre-1929 times. No need for me to linger over well-known warts on the portrait of every place of learning. By the way, I'm now taking a leaf from Sumner Slichter's book. He used to lecture for high fees before business audiences. When I cast my pearls before the board of directors of Standard Oil in New Jersey, I was told to name a high fee. I didn't know how to do it, so I said, give me 70% of what Sumner gets. It was the highest fee I had ever seen. But what Sumner told me in later life was, he said, I tell businessmen lots of things they want to hear, but I also insist upon telling them things that they ought to hear and that they don't want to hear. What still needs study by analysts is explanation of the following paradox. 2/3 of any Ivy League faculty in those days might be said to have mostly lacked these ancient prejudices, these hates that dare not tell their name. I am overlooking, of course, natural modes of habitual speech that would today betoken inadmissible animus against minorities, ethnic jokes and the like, which really didn't mean very much. But by some law of sociobiology, the majority had neither the courage nor the effective leverage to overrule the virulence of the minority, until finally the floodgates broke down. Within the lifetime of one academic, a George Homans or an Edward Mason, Harvard went from a George D. Berkoff as dean to Henry Rosovsky. Of American universities, it can be said, you've come a long way, baby. That's because the distance to climb was a vast one. In describing the university of the 1930s, I must emphasize that economics then especially attracted the ablest of students. Keen minds that would have gone in prosperous times into physics, biology, the law, and business were then recruited into lifetime careers in economics. Charles Lamb had to have the peasant's house burned down in order to roast pig. It is not really worthwhile to have a Great Depression just in order to recruit a Tobin or Solow or Modigliani into the study of what Keynes once called our most agreeable branch of the moral sciences. But let us thank the gods for little favors and cold comforts. My next section is called Treason of the Clerks. The Veritas Foundation formed by a descendant of Theodore Roosevelt and a subset of reactionary Harvard alumni, had matters ludicrously wrong when it labeled Harvard a hotbed of liberalism in the 1930s, subverted by Walter Lippmann's and other visiting committee pinks with unsound money notions. Lippmann actually then was an advocate of laissez-faire, a member of no less the Mount Pelerin Society, founded by types like Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and Milton Friedman to lobby for the market economy. At the 350th centenary, as moderator of the panel that included Martin Feldstein, Benjamin Friedman, and James Tobin, I emphasized that the Harvard Economics Department was anti-Keynesian in the 1930s, and it was the lumpen proletariat of the instructors who rallied to Hanson's banner. What I also was careful to emphasize at the 350th centenary, that Harvard was not only the best place to study Keynes, but also it was the best place to learn the best rational and empirical critiques of Keynesianism. Long before there was a Pigou effect in print, I learned about it from Vasily Leontiev and Gottfried Haberler. At a low enough price level, Leontiev would say, this dime I hold here could employ all the unemployed. Haberler's Pre-General Theory, first edition of Prosperity and Depression, compared and contrasted with his next two editions, presents a balanced critique of the new paradigms. I shall soon speak of John Williams and his fruitful interaction with Alvin Hansen in the celebrated fiscal policy seminar in Litauer. I invite modern readers to revisit Williams' 1948 AER critique of Keynesianism, which compares embarrassingly well with recent polemics on that subject. Like Beethoven, I do not come to my point fast, but I do come to it. This section is entitled Alvin Hansen. When Tolstoy began the novel Anna Karenina, he envisaged her one way, but she quite ran away with him, emerging as the immortal we all know. When first planning this Godkin lecture, I thought to picture Alvin Hansen as the first among a number of equals. As Professor Eitan Shashinsky of Hebrew University had said to me, to economists born after World War II, Hansen is only a name, a gifted expositor of Keynes and Hicks, and one who bet on the wrong horse of secular stagnation. However, as I did my research and as springs of memory were stirred, I realized that Hansen did deserve the twin billing with Harvard itself. He was the catalyst and leader of our whole group. Scientifically, it was Hansen who first worked out how the various fiscal parameters of taxes, tax rates, expenditures, and deficit entered into the laissez-faire 1936 general theory. And it was Hansen who deduced what would be the signs and approximate magnitudes of their comparative statistical impacts on endogenous variables. I have put into the record that my own analysis of the interactions of the accelerator and the multiplier, which brought me youthful kudos, came from working out for Hansen the correct and general properties of the model he had formulated. Moreover, Hansen was a dynamizer of the general theory in its trend growth aspects more than a decade before Joan Robinson and before Roy Harrod's 1948 essay on economic dynamics. Whereas I concentrated on the accelerator in its Frisch-Clark cycles context, Hansen by 1937 had understood from Keynes' famous 1937 Eugenics Review article, The Consequences of a Declining Population, and from Harrod's now forgotten 1936 trade cycle, Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman to lobby for the market economy. At the 350th centenary, as moderator of the panel that included Martin Feldstein, Benjamin Friedman, and James Tobin, I emphasized that the Harvard Economics Department was anti-Keynesian in the 1930s, and it was the lumpen proletariat of the instructors who rallied to Hanson's banner. What I also was careful to emphasize at the 350th centenary, that Harvard was not only the best place to study Keynes, but also it was the best place to learn the best rational and empirical critiques of Keynesianism. Long before there was a Pigou effect in print, I learned about it from Vasily Leontiev and Gottfried Haberler. At a low enough price level, Leontiev would say, this dime I hold here could employ all the unemployed. Haberler's pre-general theory, first edition of Prosperity and Depression, compared and contrasted with his next two editions, presents a balanced critique of the new paradigms. I shall soon speak of John Williams and his fruitful interaction with Alvin Hansen in the celebrated fiscal policy seminar in Litauer. I invite modern readers to revisit Williams' 1948 AER critique of Keynesianism, which compares embarrassingly well with recent polemics on that subject. Like Beethoven, I do not come to my point fast, but I do come to it. This section is entitled Alvin Hansen. When Tolstoy began the novel Anna Karenina, he envisaged her one way, but she quite ran away with him, emerging as the immortal we all know. When first planning this Godkin lecture, I thought to picture Alvin Hansen as the first among a number of equals. As Professor Eitan Shashinsky of Hebrew University had said to me, to economists born after World War II, Hansen is only a name, a gifted expositor of Keynes and Hicks, and one who bet on the wrong horse of secular stagnation. However, as I did my research and as springs of memory were stirred, I realized that Hansen did deserve the twin billing with Harvard itself. He was the catalyst and leader of our whole group. Scientifically, it was Hansen who first worked out how the various fiscal parameters of taxes, tax rates, expenditures, and deficit entered into the laissez-faire 1936 general theory. And it was Hansen who deduced what would be the signs and approximate magnitudes of their comparative statistical impacts on endogenous variables. I have put into the record that my own analysis of the interactions of the accelerator and the multiplier, which brought me youthful kudos, came from working out for Hansen the correct and general properties of the model he had formulated. Moreover, Hansen was a dynamizer of the general theory in its trend growth aspects more than a decade before Joan Robinson and before Roy Harrod's 1948 essay on economic dynamics. Whereas I concentrated on the accelerator in its Frisch-Clark cycles context, Hansen by 1937 had understood from Keynes' famous 1937 Eugenics Review article, The Consequences of a Declining Population, and from Harrod's now forgotten 1936 trade cycle, that more rapid exogenous growth calls for a widening of capital and a buoyancy of net capital formation. Whereas the reverse of that, a demographic shift towards lower population growth, calls for a problem with respect to the adequacy of full employment investment outlets. When younger Keynesians like Hagen, Gilbert, Samuelson, and the mob were betting on the wrong horse of an immediate post-war excess of full employment saving over forthcoming investment demand, Hansen was correctly expecting a restocking boom and was in the good company of such wiser Keynesians as Richard Bissell and Sumner Slichter. Richard Bissell is a member of the establishment whose name we never mention. Let me agree that Slichter always billed himself as an anti-Keynesian. But operationally, from 1934 to his death, his paradigm of analysis emphasized the dependence of consumption spending on income and the autonomous variability of investment spending. If it quacks like a duck, swims and flies like a duck, what would you call the bird? I shall return tomorrow to varieties of closet Keynesians. My stress in these lectures, as will appear even more clearly in tomorrow's discussion, is on Kuhnian evaluation of macro science. From this viewpoint, Hansen had an importance that Seymour Harris, Richard Gilbert, Lachlan Curry, and Mariner Eccles could not be expected to have. In honoring Hansen, I do not slight the important task of Robert Bryce, the greatest Canadian civil servant of our time, who served as the Canadian John the Baptist, who brought to Middlesex County the Keynesian gospel before the General Theory Testament had reached the Gutenberg print stage. Let me also say as a throwaway line that about Alvin Hansen as a microeconomist, that when Jacob Viner researched who was the first economist to draw a U-shaped average cost curve and a marginal cost curve which by some marvelous coincidence exactly pierces it through its bottom, which was really hot stuff in my day, his search ended with a Hansen paper of the 1920s. And in view of Hansen's innocence of the calculus and other mathematics, as Schumpeter would say, this is indeed a feather in his scientist's hat. Well, now I come to a section called Son of the Middle Border. When Hansen had retired, I will tell you, by the way, when we're near the end, and you can prepare. I once got an honorary degree in Belgium. There's nothing more boring than speeches on such occasions. But a French speech to an English speech is as the Oxford Dictionary to a pocket variety. And a speaker with one page of notes came, and I listened, and in my imperfect French, I discerned that he was saying, our true speaker can't be here, so I will read his speech for him. He put away this marvelous, parsimonious one page of notes and picked up a huge manuscript. At least you can always pace yourself. The more astute of you, you've been gauging the size of this pile in comparison with that pile, perhaps with sinking heart. It was hopeless. He took the top page and put it underneath the bottom page. I shall never forget. When Hansen had retired, I tried to coax out of him an autobiography. I would even have settled for a little memoir. You must, alas, rely on my few memories. These days of meritocracy, leading scientists hail often from the Bronx School of Science, Exeter Academy, and Scarsdale or New Trier high schools. It was different in the generation of my teachers. Alvin Hansen, like Frank Knight or Thorsten Veblen, came off the farm. Frank Knight used to say the only reason that he became an economist was his feet hurt following the plow. Hansen was born on the South Dakota spread. His immigrant father had homesteaded in the 1870s. When Alvin died, he still owned that farm. His parents came to these shores not to make it, the usual reason, for a reason you will not believe. They came to escape religious persecution in Lutheran Denmark. I asked Alvin what their crime was. They were Baptists. All of Hansen's neighbors near Yankton, South Dakota, were Danes, except for the doctor, who perforce married a Dane. By the way, I wasn't sure there'd be an expert on this subject in the house. In my classes at MIT, I say, is there a chemist in the room? And when they say no, I say, in that case, the second law of thermodynamics says. Well, the written record will, I hope, be corrected. Alvin liked school, and he told me it was a blow when his father insisted he could not be spared from his work on the farm. In desperation, Alvin swore that he would do twice the work in half the time if only he could continue in high school. It was a close thing. After finishing high school, like John Williams, Hanson taught school for a long enough period to accumulate the funds to go to Yankton College. Yes, Virginia, there is a Yankton College, or rather, it died a year ago. There was a Yankton College. And eventually, he entered the graduate school at the University of Wisconsin. I could hardly contain my laughter when that prodigiously hard worker John Black once said solemnly, in Madison, we had Alvin figured for just a plugger. John R. Commons learned better. His graduate assistant, Selig Perlman, I'm dropping names here, but what magnificent names I'm dropping for connoisseur economists. Looking over the students' term papers, called to Commons' attention the superior quality of Hanson's work. After a stay at Brown University, Hanson became a world-recognized scholar at Minnesota. He was prolific and versatile, so it was natural for him to be tapped by Roosevelt's New Deal. Paradoxically, up until 1932, Alvin Hanson was something of a devotee of Say's law, according to which overproduction is essentially impossible. At the end of Hanson's business cycle theory book, which carries the significant date of 1927, he speculates that the business cycle may be a thing of the past as capitalism outgrows its diseases of childhood and transition. At another place, he writes that in the debate between the underconsumptionist Malthus and the orthodox Ricardo, anyone who thinks the matter through will conclude that Ricardo was essentially right. Hanson's 1932 book, Economic Stabilization in an Unstable World, the pre-Harvard book that won him renown, still prescribed wage cutting as the mode of achieving recovery from the Great Depression. Hanson in the late 1930s was in his low 50s and looked older. Short of stature and stooped, he moved energetically. At the height of his fame, graduate students even took to wearing the green eye shade that Hanson's Scandinavian inheritance required him to wear against the sun's bright rays. It was not by eloquence or classroom showmanship that he commanded respect. His voice was relatively low. If you call Simon Kuznitz's voice 10 and mine 100, Hanson scaled in at 25. Because he packed so much that was relevant into his 50 minutes of class time, not infrequently, undergraduates and graduates would applaud at lecture's end. Needless to say, not an everyday occurrence then or now. Alvin Hanson was a prodigious worker, but so were his colleagues Black, Harris, Mason, and Slichter. Even Schumpeter, despite an affectation of leisureliness, was a type A personality who burned the midnight and weekend oil at the sacrifice of his longevity. Every young scholar, it is said, must have a role model and mentor. I am an exception. I count a dozen mentors. Aaron Director, Henry Simons, Lloyd Mintz, Paul Douglas, Jacob Viner, and Frank Knight at Chicago. Imagine, Aaron Director, the chap who speaks of Milton Friedman, my radical brother-in-law, my first teacher in economics. At Harvard, Schumpeter, Leontief, Haberler, E.B. Wilson, Harris, and Hanson. I had finished all coursework before Hanson arrived on the scene. So, although our good dean's introduction, although it was well told, was not literally accurate in every respect. Formally, Hanson was never my teacher or examiner. Nevertheless, it was Hanson who most closely filled the role in human terms of an academic father. A true story tells something about two different personalities. When Chicago called me to a chair in 1947, Schumpeter said, "That is a tremendous compliment to you at so young an age." Hanson's comment was, "The Midwest is an important region that needs an economist of your qualities." After Alvin Hansen had fully retired, he once said to me, "Paul, I never discussed with you your prospects at Harvard. I never thought that appropriate." Imagine how different times were in the old days. Now that the statute of limitations has expired, if you like, I'll review the story. I was glad to be able to reply, "Alvin, you were right the first time." In these Godkin lectures, I am downplaying the role Hansen exercised in recruiting Cambridge talent for the New Deal and the war effort. Like Felix Frankfurter with lawyers, Hansen did fulfill such a function. It is the fast-fading picture of Hansen as an innovative scientist that I'm trying to render justice to. One cannot recall Hansen at Harvard without recalling the Hansen-Williams team. Not believing in elegant variation, I shall merely quote some lines of digression I gave here last spring at the lecture series to celebrate the Kennedy School's 50th anniversary. And John Williams was the first dean of the Graduate School of Public Administration. John Williams, that first dean of the Litauer School, as we called it, formed with Alvin Hansen, I'm reading, a remarkable duo. If to teach is to affirm, then Williams should have become a banker full-time. But if to teach is to raise doubt, Williams was a brilliant success. Actually, Williams' Cracker Barrel, seemingly relaxed manner, made him a splendid teacher. He recruited hundreds of undergraduates to major in economics. And Seymour Harris would lose tens of those undergraduates to the government department. That is not in my text. Inevitably, Hansen, the pioneer of a new scientific paradigm, the liberal story, stole the show and attracted the bulk of the graduate students destined to become eminent. Robert Rosa, Paul Volcker, and Henry Wallach, who was in both camps, are only a few of the protégés Williams launched at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where from the early 1930s to mid-century, Williams was vice president and research sage. If people who need people are the happiest people in the world, then this first Kennedy School dean ought to have been miserable. Actually, he was merely reserved and aloof, almost indolent, as a good dean should be, to maintain his creative scholarship. After his retirement, Williams lived for decades as a recluse from colleagues and students. It does both Hansen and Williams enormous credit that they never undercut each other in the classroom or outside. It was rarely like this in continental universities, and certainly not in the London School of Economics, Cambridge, and the Chicago bullpens, where the disciplines of the competing stars, disciples of the competing stars, were pitted against one another, not merely on class and ideological issues, but also on mundane questions of methodology. Needless to say, the incivility of the 1965 to 1975 era was never dreamed of, even by the warring Oxford dons. Since Hansen had the disproportionate power for aggression, I suppose he merits the greater praise. Still, it would have been understandable if Williams had nursed resentment that his turf had been taken over. And yet, that private individual could say, on the occasion of both men's retirement, that Alvin Hansen had been the best friend he had ever had in academic life. God bless. I return to my final text to give you a guideline of what it is I think you'll find important in Alvin Hansen as scientist. As an analyst of business cycles, the early Hansen of 1920-1935 stressed the continental emphasis of Spitoff, Castle, Bissell, Frisch, and Schumpeter on exogenous technological waves of impact, a refreshing contrast to such money-obsessed Anglo-Saxon writers. I don't mean payroll-obsessed, I mean supply of money-obsessed, as Hawtrey, Keynes, Pigou, and Fisher. After 1935, Hansen was reborn by the general theory. He wrote so many books with Hicks-like permutations of the key words income, money, and cycles, cycles and income and money, that a modern reader will want my guide. National Income and Business Cycles of 1941 was perhaps his single most stimulating volume. Full Employment or Stagnation, 1937, his first Harvard book, was his most innovative and provoking book. I suspect his Guide to Keynes had the most continuing sales. The diagrammatics that Hansen developed from Hicks's happy exposition, these have been known ever since as the Hicks-Hansen LMIS formulations. Academics in authority who daily look to the East and damn Keynes use those gestalts as unselfconsciously as their guts use the laws of osmosis. These diagrammatics are not, as Axel Lionhead once speculated, I can't pronounce Axel Lionhead's Swedish name, they're not something tacked on to the Keynes general theory. The ISLM formulation is one of half a dozen isomorphisms with that work, along with those of Herod, Lange, Joan Robinson, Brian Reddaway, James Mead, Lerner, and my foundations. If Lionhead had been right, Keynes had plenty of time in his lifetime to repudiate them. Wives and children of intermediate text authors bless those diagrammatics at the end of every month. Actions during Franklin Roosevelt's first term were natural reactions to the peril of the hour, needing and having no coherent economic science. You did not have to have the general theory in order to have deficit financing in Washington of 1933, 1934, 1935. You didn't even need it in Herbert Hoover's time. It was as easy as falling off a log. It was in the last 50 years, going back to, say, 1936, that the Keynesian superstructure informed the Weltanschauung of the modern mixed economy. In concluding this installment, tonight's installment, let me sum up the influence of Hansen's science on real-world policy, along, of course, with the influences of Lerner and many more, in the following way. First, ask yourself, why do we no longer seriously worry about whether a great invention, say like that of the automobile, destroys more jobs than it creates? Not a hot topic in academia today. Or, why do we all sleep well at night without worrying whether the market-imputed distribution of income between rich and poor will create underconsumption? Why don't we debate the early century concerns of Rosa Luxemburg, of John A. Hobson, and V.I. Lenin as to whether a developed capitalism, to avoid catastrophic slump, must develop new colonial markets abroad and engage in militaristic imperialisms? Is it because we again believe in Say's law, a la Robert Lucas and Tom Sargent? Have Milton Friedman and Franco Modigliani, with their theories of transitory saving and life cycle consuming, put those old fears to rest? The honest answer is no. It is because of what Hansen and others added to Keynes. and others includes Keynes, informed minds are confident that some combinations of monetary and fiscal policies can offset any unbalances, long-term unbalances, in full employment, savings, and investment that exogenous trends and endogenous market solutions must bring. That is a legacy worth celebrating. Thank you.
Paul has consented to take a few questions or comments in the 10 minutes that we have remaining. We're not going to give previews of tomorrow's lecture, since so that's the only question that I'll rule out, but otherwise comments and questions are in order. This is taped for rebroadcast on public radio, so let me encourage you to use the microphones, which are here on the ground floor at the left and the right, and on the second floor. And in particular, if some of the economists who are here gathered, some of whom even remember this story, or others whose names have been used usefully or in vain, would like to make a comment. I don't know. Tom Schelling, who's a current Littauer professor. Tom, can we persuade you to make a comment or ask a question?
Well, one thing you didn't explain is how Alvin Hansen happened to tumble to Keynesianism, become an inspired missionary, and spread the gospel. I knew Alvin quite well. I was his teaching fellow for a year, and I never thought he was the brightest person on the faculty. I never thought he was the most adventurous person on the faculty. He was probably the most persevering person I ever knew. He was obstinate. Once he decided that Keynesianism was it, I can see then that he would just bite the bit and go forward. But he wasn't a terrifically inspiring person. He had a sort of a flat voice and a flat personality.
Not like you and me.
Not like you and me. And two blander people than him and John Williams is hard to imagine, and yet somehow he came out of the Middle West, and, you know, the story would have it he was riding a white horse, but he wasn't a horseman. What was there about his training, his personality, his genes, his hormones or something that made him perform this function? I would have said of all the people you mentioned, all the names you dropped, he was in the lower quartile among those whom one would have expected to become the evangelist he became.
Before I answer your question, Tom, will you answer a question for me? How did a bright, brilliant, ebullient fellow like Joseph Schumpeter manage not to adopt Keynesianism? In fact, those who shared oral exams know that it wasn't until the 1940s that he began to show some understanding of the subject. Now I will. Well, yes, please.
No, I don't have a good answer to that, except that I think that Schumpeter had a greater commitment to something else. It was not invented here, and I think he simply wasn't predisposed to adopt somebody else's ideas and become the missionary. Hansen may have been modestly quite willing to take up Keynes's views and pursue them, because I don't think Hansen ever thought that he was going to be the hero of a talk like yours 50 years later. He was a very modest, persevering person. Schumpeter was a hero, and he knew it.
Do you know how the double helix begins?
Yeah.
Jim Watson.
Mm-hmm.
I have never met Francis Crick in a modest mood.
Yeah. Crick was more like Schumpeter than like Hansen.
I have never known a Harvard professor, and I've known a lot of them, who didn't think that 50 years from now there were going to be Yeah. Well.
Okay. No, my response is I've known only one, and it was Alvin Hansen.
Well, let me speak to various aspects of the question, not professing to give a crisp, exact answer to it. But I want to scotch one hypothesis. It was the Duke of Wellington, whom Bob Solow quotes so often, at a court ball in full regalia, all honors, ribbons, velvet breeches and everything, who was encountered by a member present who came up to him and said, Mr. Smith, I believe. And the Duke of Wellington replied, sir, if you can believe that, you can believe anything. If you think that it was Alvin Hansen's capacity for hard work that did the job, you are way wrong. There are high IQ people everywhere in academia, at Colorado State that I mentioned before, and they're hard workers everywhere. It was not that extra bit of hard work. The late Stanley Ulam, a great mathematician and raconteur, used to say that he had a formula for what greatness and reputation in mathematics depended upon. There's many variables in the formula: how hard you worked, who your father-in-law was, your ability. And he said he kept manipulating the formula, and finally he found that ability entered in both the numerator and denominator, and it could be canceled right out. It may be the case that ability is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition. And indeed, if you and I want to sit in coffee room conversation about our elders and betters, the puzzle of Edward Chamberlain is a much deeper puzzle than the puzzle of Alvin Hansen. Alvin Hansen was underrated by people who looked at surface phenomena. He was a keen analytic mind, and we must thank the Lord that at the age of 50, he's almost the only case in American economics, and maybe they're not in British economics, where somebody at so advanced an age has taken after a new paradigm. I'm instructed by the dean not to give away anything of tomorrow's lecture, but I will comment some about that. I guess I feel a little bit about Alvin Hansen, based on my experience, the way Mark Twain felt about his father. Samuel Clemens said, when I was 14, I thought my father was awful dumb, but by the time I was 21, I was surprised how much the old chap had smartened up. The more I knew Alvin Hansen, the greater my respect for him. The House of Scholarship and Science has many mansions. You don't have, all of you don't have to be Bob Solows, although we could use a few more. Hansen, I don't infringe on the future, had what Keynes had, a great intuitive sense of what's important. And I'll illustrate this with two instances. In 1941, when the war effort began, economists recruited to OPM and OPA, War Production Board, and businessmen were. And a great debate broke out. What was America's capacity to produce? Because our economy had been asleep all through the Great Depression. Our net capital formation, as measured by Kuznets, was literally zero for the whole decade. It was an unknown figure. And the economists under the banner of Richard Gilbert, who deserves much more notice than I was able to give, the father of Wally Gilbert. They put a very high figure. And the businessmen said, that is ridiculous. We can't come remotely near to that. 50,000 airplanes a year? That man in the White House is crazy. Keynes happened to come over on a visit, so they asked the great sage, and he said, well, let me think. How long was it from 1914 to 1929? A little bit longer than from 1929 to the present. How much did real product grow in that period? That's about the amount, adjusting for the slight difference in length of time, that I think might be the growth in potential for the U.S. now. The economists were delighted because that more or less hit on the nose their number. Both of them were in slight underestimation, Keynes and the economists. Now I come to Hansen. Right after the war, Everett Hagen and Nora Body Kilpatrick did a elaborate econometric study of what the growth potential of the United States was. And it appeared in the American Economic Review. And I went to see Alvin Hansen one day, and I mentioned it to him. And he said, don't tell me what the answer is. Let me guess. So he sat down and figured the ham bone is attached to the shin bone, and the shin bone is attached to the hip bone, population will grow this much and productivity will grow that much. Then he gave the number. I was utterly deflated because that was the number that they had given. Now, that doesn't grow on every Homestead Act farm in the country, nor does every graduate of the Bronx School of Science come out with the capacity for making those judgments. I think we have to. There's an inexplicable element, as you know from your own graduate school. Graduate students know about each other something that the people above them do not know, and the people below them do not know. But what they know is not exactly right. There are late bloomers and early bloomers, and both Williams and Hansen, for example. And by the way, Williams was no pedestrian mind. Far from it. Reread the 48 AER article. These were, in my judgment, extremely fertile scholars in, as Keynes pointed out, a area of study in which it's neither mathematical nicety or shirt sleeve common sense. Common sense is very uncommon in our field. It's much more common than good sense, but it's hard to find that. So I think we should take the gift from the gods and also look at that at the U-shaped cost curve. There was a talent there that was not apparent.
It's my sad responsibility to say that we've come to the end of the hour for the local work rules. We can't keep Paul working all night, but let me remind you, at 4 o'clock here tomorrow in the Star Auditorium. I won't try to explain to you how to get there, but if you come here and ask somebody, they'll get you there. At 4 o'clock, the second lecture will be given. The title of it is The Structure of the Scientific Revolution, and after that we'll have occasion to put some more questions to Paul and to enjoy such a wonderful occasion. So thank you very much.